Hello, I'm Father Sebastian. We're at our church here in Cornville, Arizona, outside of Sedona, Arizona, St. Gregory, Palamas, Orthodox Church.
Father, why are we here today?
Well, as you know, we did a video earlier with you, and where I was discussing my journey from traditionalism into Orthodoxy, and I was trying to keep that necessarily, to the high points. And frankly, the decision to move into traditionalism in the first place is something that I hadn't really thought about in a long time. It's something I resolved for myself many years previous, 25, 30 years ago. So it really just wasn't on my mind. We were discussing it. However, reading comments and getting a sense to in my own research of realizing that the landscape of Catholicism has really changed a lot since I was there. And well, I think it was pretty fair statement that almost all of the serious Catholics back when I was one were traditionally minded. That no longer seems to be the case. I think that there's a pretty serious Novus Ordo contingent now, and many of these, of course, are in the Byzantine Rite. One thing I didn't mention, really probably should have mentioned, was that I also had spent time in the Byzantine Rite, and I wanted to sort of rectify that today and explain, what that experience was. It was a good experience, and explain how I guess it fits into the bigger picture, and I guess just provide the rest of the story that was lacking in the first video. And really, it's a long story, so it's probably good that we're doing a separate video anyway, because it's there's a lot of different twists and turns to get to that point.
So what was your experience with the Byzantine Rite? What led you to it, and why did you not stick with it?
Yeah, so first of all, as just mentioned, I mean, my experience with the Byzantine Rite was actually very positive. I did not leave because I had any issues in terms of like people were rude or anything. Back when I was with the Byzantine Rite, it was quite a bit different, I think, than it is now. This was back in the early 90s, and right around the time that Pope John Paul II came out with his two-lung theory. Or his position there, he wanted the East essentially to go back and embrace its roots. So that was just starting to take place, but hadn't been fully implemented yet. And a number of the churches that I went to had what we'd call Latinizations. I remember one church, the primary one that I went to, still had a communion rail. They had Eucharistic adoration, just a lot of things that I'm guessing don't exist anymore in the Byzantine. And this is largely due to the fact that, as was explained to me by various priests at the time, that the West had a pretty heavy hand on the East, the Eastern Catholic churches, especially pre-Vatican II. A lot of persecution against the married priests and things of this nature. This was from their own mouth. They told me this directly. This isn't speculation. So, but anyway, from my perspective as a refugee, if you will, from the Roman Rite and all the issues that were going on there at the time, I thought it was great. I loved it. And it's honestly what exposed me. It was the first stage in my journey to Orthodoxy that took, about 2 decades to complete. But it was the first step. It exposed me to the incredible beauty of the East, the Eastern worship. And, at the time, though, it was also kind of a rarity. Like, I was one of maybe one or two other people that I would see at church that were there for that reason. It was still very ethnic. These were churches that at the time were, that's what they were. They were small enclaves in big cities, and they were starting to die out, actually. And one of the things that was going on in Pittsburgh, actually, at the time where I was attending, is they were starting to consolidate a lot of the smaller churches and combine them with larger churches. And this was creating a bunch of, consternation for the people. And anyway, it was all part of that process, though, to sort of, move the church to kind of a new phase, the Byzantine church to kind of a new phase of things. So, it was a great experience. Didn't have any issues with it in terms of the people, in terms of, the worship there. But the issue that I did have is that I had already studied enough of Catholic theology. And by studying Catholic theology, what I really mean is studying pre-Vatican II, basically the theology that would have been present until, about the beginning of the 20th century. And maybe shortly there into it, but the Baltimore Catechism style of Catholicism. And I just saw there being way too many incompatibilities with what I experienced in the Novus Ordo. And so that's what led me there. But what I eventually came to understand was that I'm still part of the Novus Ordo, right? Like I don't escape those problems by simply going into the Byzantine Rite. While it's true the liturgical abuses and things of that nature and some of the disorders were not nearly as present, they weren't really at that time present at all. But still, being a part of that organization was bothersome for me, especially when it came to theological considerations. And I just kind of liken it in terms of the organization. Like if there's obviously there's exceptional things and there's things that are more relevant or tied to the organization itself or follow from certain principles that or organization operates by. So for me, it's like I have problems with the organization. I have problems with popes that are making statements that are in almost direct contradiction with previous statements that popes have made, which, from a Catholic perspective, just can't happen. Like it's not acceptable to have that. When you say, and we'll talk about that today, why some of the specifics there, but those were concerning to me, and I realized that you're still part of the same operational structure. You're still subject to those problems. And I had problems with it. I had problems with a number of things that are going on. And look, in our own church, as in the Orthodox Church, obviously every church, every organization has issues as far as the people are concerned that are in it. But it's also, once again, there's a question of is this exist as an exception to the principles, or does it follow from the principles of the organization? And I found that there were things that followed from the principles of that organization that gave me cause for pause. So I have some specific, there's some specific examples like stories, incidents that happened that kind of impressed this upon me. The first one, I think, probably the most significant one really was I got involved with a Russian Catholic church. At the time, I'm not sure if they're still around, but at the time there were only two of them. One in New York and one, I believe it was in Costa Mesa. It was somewhere in LA. I think it was Costa Mesa that I went to. And it was amazing. It was almost too good to be true. It was one of those kind of things where I showed up and, the people were super nice. I had expressed my interest in wanting to become a priest there, and everybody was very open to that, very supportive of that. I literally had one guy offered me his daughter, like, here you go, beautiful woman, here's my daughter, you can marry her. Like, it was really funny, and whatever. It was endearing and I think it was well spirited. I didn't take anything, wrong from that. And everything was going well there. The thing about the Byzantine Rite, and I understand why there's such a draw to it, because in many respects it's the best of both worlds, right? You get to have the beautiful Eastern theology, the beautiful Eastern worship, right? And when I say the theology, I mean, in addition to being beautiful, it's less rigid and it's more welcoming, I think, to people today. I think it's very appealing to people. And I think if I have any, and I mentioned this briefly in the last video we did, but one of the concerns that I have, or at least it's kind of a frustration, I guess, is that I think what's happened is because of now how much the Byzantine world has gained in prominence, Eastern Christian teaching, Orthodox teaching, basically is coming into the mainstream and sort of being co-opted by Catholic sources and presented as though they're organic to them when they're really not. And like I said, we'll probably explore that a little bit more, but this kind of came to a head for me. I was like most people that I think are there. I wanted the what drew me to the Eastern Rite wasn't necessarily these beautiful things initially. It was that I was looking to escape the problems of the Novus Ordo. And then once I got there, I realized how beautiful it was and I started to grow into it. But, the thing about the Eastern Rite is probably the best thing, and why I believe the majority of at least converts are there now, is because you get to have your Pope and eat him too. Right? I mean, that's what people want. People want what the East has, but they're not willing or able to get over the idea of the papacy. So we're going to discuss that. I want to spend a decent amount of time discussing that. But all this came to a head for me when I was at this church because I started working towards seminary, looking at the details of what's going to be required to become a priest there. And I remember being there, still remember very clearly, after, it was trapeza, after the meal, after the service. And I'm talking, I believe it was to one of the deacons there. And we're going through the process, and he's telling me, it's okay, we're going to send you to, the Greek Orthodox Seminary in Massachusetts. I'm like, okay, cool, da-da-da-da. And I said, when do I do the Catholic? When do I go to the Catholic seminary? And he says, you don't. Like, he looks at me with this puzzled look, like, why would you want to do that? And it was just so striking. I realized, once again, that's one narrow experience there, but I do think it was pretty indicative of, I think there were other instances where I would see sort of that sentiment. It's like a lot of people there, they don't even think about being Catholic, but I wanted to be Catholic. I didn't want to be anything other than Catholic. I wanted to be Catholic at the time, but express the faith in a manner that would be, like I say, they're liturgically sound and, all the rest of it. But it was very surprising, that reaction, and ultimately what followed from that, which was when I kind of pushed the issue, it was just hands off at that point. Like, it was clear the whole spirit and the dynamic had shifted. And once again, I'm thankful that it happened that way, because I didn't go and waste a bunch of time, but just it just really struck me hard that there would be this, hey, we're going to do everything that's Orthodox, but we acknowledge the Pope somehow. And so the big question on my mind was, and I've never gotten an answer to this, is, well, then what does it mean to follow the Pope? Like, if you don't, like, what is the value to you? What does it even mean if you're not going to study Catholic theology? And I understand, once again, this is a narrow thing. I realize other Byzantine Catholics don't necessarily do this, but you have saints, you acknowledge saints in the Byzantine Rite that are condemned, by at least theologians in the Catholic Church from the previous centuries. It's a strange dichotomy. It's a strange mix. And as I've grown to learn Eastern theology, obviously as a priest, and the preparatory steps to that, I've just really come to see how they're just not compatible. Eastern theology and modern day Catholic theology, especially, but even of course anything post-schism, is just not. They were just not in coherence. And so in the Byzantine Rite, you encapsulate this admixture of things that don't mix. And I think that's really the big struggle for me, the thing that I could just never really get over. So, I mean, as much as I wanted it to work, right, as much as I could check all the boxes in my mind that mattered, it just seemed like a false solution. It was a false hope, a false confidence, because there's just no way you can put these things together. And all the other things too, just kind of the periphery things, all the ecumenical spirit of things, all of these things were all very problematic for me, because when it all comes down to it, there can be only one, right? One Lord, one faith, one baptism, right? I mean, there's one true church. There can only be one true church. And so when churches who profess to be the true church then turn around and say, oh, but other churches are means of salvation, that's a problem. That's a real problem. And that, I think, is the prevailing spirit of our age, unfortunately. And I think it's infected all religions, including my own, on to a lesser degree. I don't think it's a huge problem for us, but I know that there are some elements there as well, and especially in certain jurisdictions, it's a little more prominent than others. But this is just not acceptable. This is not something. It doesn't mean we have to be rude to people or judge them or something. But we have to be clear about what we believe and understand that it is different, and to stand on our own values and on our own faith. Yeah, so it's interesting because I was with the Byzantine Rite before I was SSPX. I became SSPX afterwards. But in time, I came to realize that really, while there's some differences, the SSPX position and the Byzantine Catholic position are a lot more similar than different, in that they both have this idea that they can accept the Pope when he says things that would support their own beliefs, but then they just kind of ignore or reject him when he doesn't. That's when I have your Pope and need him too. Is you accept him, you laud him, you stand behind him and rally behind him. When he says something that supports the faith, and these modern popes have done that. There's a really an admixture. They'll make good statements, and then they'll make statements, or should say good in the sense of Catholic. They'll make fully Catholic statements, and they'll make arguably not Catholic statements. And when you're in the middle of that, you have to sort of what does it say to a contest? We call it the golden sifter, you're getting to decide what's Catholic and what's not. And when you think about it, that's completely, once again, antithetical to how Catholicism works. The papacy is the highest authority in the church. And no one shall judge the papacy. And yet, in all of these different, more traditional styles of Catholicism, that's exactly what you're doing. You're setting yourself up as a higher authority to the Pope. And I think the last thing that kind of always bothered me a little bit is just about the Eastern Rite, the Byzantine Rite, is how much like its place in the church, I guess, maybe like where it fits in the church, or where it fits in the grand scheme of salvation. I mean, at least at the time, I wasn't really aware of any saints. I mean, I don't know if that's changed now, but I mean, you don't really have much in the way of Byzantine Catholic saints, and really just the whole origins of the church are strange. Like, why does the Byzantine Catholic Church even exist? The best I've ever been able to figure out is it essentially came about due to political conquest. You have Catholics who conquered Orthodox lands and essentially said, okay, you can keep your churches, you can keep your faith as long as you acknowledge the Pope, or we're going to destroy you, basically. And so I'm not going to say it was convert or die. I don't know to what degree, all the specifics in terms of that, but I do think there was a political push. That we kind of forget about that now in the ecumenical world, but back then it was definitely there was an element of that where, Catholic knights would go into lands, and I'm not saying once again that makes everything he did terrible, but it was a thing to go into lands and to force the people to convert. And I think the Byzantine Rite largely came into existence for that reason, at least initially. Now there might have been, down the road other churches that came in for other reasons, but I think as far as the origins, all the Ukrainians, Ruthenians, those were all Russian territories. Those were all Orthodox countries and Orthodox peoples that then became Catholic when they were, the Poles, the Lithuanians, all the knights came in there and overtook those lands. So, it just always seemed to be kind of a dubious status, kind of an orphan in the Roman Church itself, not really much in the way of saints. These were just not signs that gave me, even outside of anything else, just kind of didn't give me the sense that it was really something of God, that had sort of the marks in that sense. I mean, I guess you could argue if it's universal or not in terms of where it's located. I don't want to get into those. I mean, that could be argued either way, but it just didn't have that sense of being like this wide-reaching church. And so once again, maybe not a big deal, but it was just something that was on my mind at the time and kind of factored into everything else. And especially once again, as I continue to learn about the dichotomy within it, it would just seem to me like, why would I want to be part of an organization? Ultimately, it came down to this. Why would I be part of an organization in addition to all the scandals that were taking place at the time? That's already a huge issue. But just, kind of attributing that to other factors, what I knew for certain was I am a part of a church as a Catholic that essentially has violated its own principles, right? It has the principle that whatever the Pope teaches in his ordinary universal magisterium is belief. These are teachings you have to believe, and yet, you have a church, a New Order church that operates in contradistinction to those things. And I will prove these points. In a moment, I'm going to go and actually read the statements from the church. This isn't just my speculation or my opinion. Like, I can actually show how that's the case. And these are the same resources that I was studying at the time, and it was just creating a huge crisis of faith for me. However, because I, like many that I'm sure in the same position, it's hard. It's a will issue. It wasn't a knowledge issue. I kind of knew what I needed to do, but my will was still hung up. I grew up, in the church, in the Catholic Church, and it was just hard to leave it. It was hard to accept that, hey, this means maybe I've been living a lie for my whole life. That's a hard thing to accept. And I think, sadly, a lot of people stay there for that reason. They're just not willing or able to get over that. But ultimately, it doesn't matter how we start. It matters how we end, how we finish. And so that's what I tell people that, I've been having conversations with about this is, the experience you've had have helped you to get where you are now. Don't keep looking back like Lot's wife, who became a pillar of salt. Like, you got to move forward. Like, okay, it's just the nature of it. If you're not moving, you're not growing, you're not getting better. It's really important to be able to acknowledge that, okay, well, maybe this wasn't the best thing I was doing, and make those course corrections. And that's what I saw a lot of this. But I got hung up too, to be sake of full disclosure. It took me some time. And so I guess I wasn't quite ready to go into Catholicism or to traditional Catholicism yet. And so, I went to a Catholic and Novus Ordo monastery in Laredo, Texas. I don't remember the name of it now. I was only there for a short time, but Another kind of thing, it was just really strange, almost like too good to be true. I went there and I told them what my intentions were, and that once again, the monks there were very embracing. They were very nice. I had some student loan debt at the time that they just offered to pay. Hey, we have benefactors, we can get those taken care of, send you to seminary, blah, blah, blah. Everything just laid out for me on a silver platter. And I was just like, this just doesn't seem right. Something doesn't seem right. And I just remember, trying to figure out what it was. It honestly was just intuition. It was just, I believe it was just the grace of the Holy Spirit is what I think it really was. And I remember going to one of their masses, and it was the last day I was there, and seeing this man who, for all intents and purposes, was putting his whole heart and soul into what he was doing. Like, I believe he was genuine. I think he was really performing the Mass to the best of his abilities. He was well-intentioned, well-disposed. Nothing on him. I mean, I think he really meant what he was doing. But it was in that moment that, having had experience at that point, the Byzantine Rite, the Eastern services, and I want to say I had experienced at least a couple of Latin Masses by that point too. I just recognized that this is the best the Novus Ordo has to offer, and it comes up short. It just doesn't have that depth. It doesn't have the real sacred. It hasn't preserved the sacred that these other, the other rite and the Latin traditional Latin Mass had preserved. And so it was from that point that I then moved on. Now, interesting story. How did I find out about traditionalism? In a Byzantine Catholic monastery, of all places. So I need to give this story a little bit. I think it'll help provide a bit of context. So when I left Thomas Aquinas College, the part of the story I didn't include last time is I went to, I don't think I mentioned it, maybe I did, but I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville briefly. And that was, at the time, it was purporting itself to be the last great Catholic university. I did not find it to be that way at all. I did not have a good experience there. Everything about that place was, the people were fine, but it had some major issues. And the whole charismatic thing, for anybody who doesn't know, at least it was a big proponent of the charismatic movement. It was Franciscan University, so it was Franciscans that ran it, and they were really into that. And I had some super weird experiences with that whole thing. And a lot of it was like the supposedly speaking in tongues, at the liturgy, at the Mass. And, but it was just so weird. And, especially when you understand, like, I won't turn this into the whole big thing about the charismatic deal, but there's a lot of major issues there. When you think about, Pentecost, you think about when the apostles go and when they're speaking, right? And everybody's hearing in their own language, right? That's what speaking in tongues is. Speaking in tongues is speaking in a language that people understand. But what we have today in the charismatic movement and the Pentecostals and all that is really the opposite of that, right? You're speaking in a language that nobody understands, which is what the devils do, right? If we're going to be honest. And so it was funny because we'd go to Mass there, and once again, this all just contributes to why I left the Novus Ordo. This is a kind of a major part of it. Here I am. They have 3 Masses a day, and I can't really go to any of them. To be fair, the one at 6 in the morning, they had one at like 6 in the morning, 6:30 or something. They had one at like 11:30 and then one at 5. The one at 11:30 and 5, those ones had usually certain parts of the Mass, people would start going into their gibberish, and it was just too weird. It was so distracting and just weird. I mean, just, did not have a good sense about it. I guess at the early one, I never went to the early one. I'm not, early guy, morning guy. So, but supposedly people tell me there wasn't any of that. So the big joke around campus was the Holy Spirit not awake yet? Like, why isn't he doing his thing then? But whatever that was. But what cinched the deal for me was they have these things called FOPs, which stands for Festival of Praise. And once again, I don't know if they do this anymore, but back then, many years ago, I decided to go to one just to see, how bad they were, because I'm hearing all these stories like, this can't be real. This can't be real. And I get in there, and I know I'm in trouble when the MC comes down. I understand this is in the church. This is actually in the church they have there on the campus. And with the tabernacle there, right? The vigil lamp is on, indicating that, the tabernacle has, from their perspective, the body and blood of Christ. And we're getting ready. The MC comes out and says, "Hey, I've been asked to request that you don't dance on the pews." And I'm like, oh boy. So anyway, so they have a rock band up there on the, whatever it was, like the altar was like a stage or something. I don't remember exactly how it was all laid out, but there's a rock band up there doing their thing, just like a Protestant service. And everybody starts getting down and doing their thing and dancing and just kind of, and then all of a sudden I start hearing all the gibberish, stuff going on, and people start falling down, getting slain in the spirit, right? And I'm like, all right, I'm out. So I saw enough, and I start running for the door, and I have people coming after me wanting to lay hands on me. And I just put my fingers in the cross and get away from me. It's just crazy, absolutely insane. And it's sad because these are good people. They're well-intentioned. They're just, from my perspective, it's diluted. It's sad. They don't really know and this is another problem, I guess. Actually, as I'm thinking about this, there's a tendency within both Protestantism, and I think it's impacted now. It's very much a part of, or at least it finds a lot of resonance in the modern Catholic Church, is this replacement of spirituality with emotionalism, with sentimentality. They're not in any way, shape, or form the same things. Okay, one is ordered to your passions. Okay, the other is ordered to your noetic intellect, your nous. Right? They're completely different faculties, completely different things, and once again, because the West has lost any kind of sense or notion of what the nous is, they don't even know the difference. And so what gets passed off a lot of times as Catholic or Protestant spirituality is really just pure emotionalism or sentimentality. It's not the same thing at all. And you can only really tell the difference, like the only way you can really discern the difference is having experienced both. If you've never experienced like a true, once again, experience God in his energies, as we say, if you've never had that experience, you don't have any frame of comparison. And I think that's the problem for most people. They just don't know. They have this powerful experience and God is somehow a part of it, therefore it must be good. I think it's kind of the process that they use to arrive at their conclusions. But, once again, we talked about kind of last time, it's the devil can use that. That's how we fall into prelates. That's how we get deluded, is by getting the passions inflamed and having it lead us to do things that we think are good but really aren't. So anyway, I saw a lot of that too that was really off-putting. But to be fair, I didn't have any frame of comparison either. I just had enough sense to say that's wrong. I don't know what's better. I mean, I couldn't say, once again, I couldn't define in those terms yet, but I could identify and recognize that's not it, right? So while I was there at Steubenville, this is kind of how to bring it back. There was a person there who recommended to me, because I basically just did one semester there, and I was like, this is not for, this is terrible. I'm not going to waste any more money here. I was recommended. It was recommended to me by somebody that I respected, to go to Monks of Mount Tabor, I think Holy Transfiguration Monastery in outside of Ukiah, Redwood City, Northern California area. And so I went there and honestly had a good experience. Once again, the monks there were very generous, and it was nice. I was there during nativity time frame. And my last day, or like the second last day that I was there, on Sunday, I was going to go, at the time, I'd always go to the bookstore. Any place I went on my journey, I'd go to books, buy books, and kind of try to grow my faith and my knowledge that way. And of course, back then I would equate the two. I wouldn't equate them now, but at the time, that's how I saw it. Faith and knowledge being the same thing, which they're really not. But anyways, I couldn't go there on the day that I needed to go. And so the following day, when I was getting ready to leave, one of the monks, the abbot there, said, yeah, here, this monk, take him down to the bookstore. So I go down to the bookstore and I'm looking at the books, and they have all these really weird books. And I'm like, what's this about? And all these weird apparitions and all kinds of just weird stuff. And I said, well, what is this? Like everything I've seen up to now, place seemed legit. And so the guy looks around, he closes the door and says, let me tell you. And so he gives me the whole rundown on the monastery. And all the, they had, I guess they had charismatic prayer things. They just didn't have it when I was there because it was, the season, they just didn't do it. And anyway, it turns out he was SSPX, and he had gone to that monastery to try it out and see if he could make it work or whatever. And he was getting ready to leave. So he gave me the whole rundown and on things. And so anyway, it was very interesting at the time. Once again, I wasn't quite ready to do it. And so it was after that I went, I did some other things. And then, I finally went to that monastery I just mentioned in Texas. Well, so I'm at this monastery in Texas. I just said, look, guys, I appreciate everything that you're doing for me. This isn't going to work. And I pack up all my stuff, and they're like, "What do we do? What do we do?" And I'm like, "It's not you, it's me." One of those things, And I honestly couldn't articulate it. I wasn't lying to them. I honestly didn't know. I just something's not right here. I just need to go, and I didn't even bother. So I just jump in the car and I start driving north. I don't know. It was I-35 or something, and I'm like, "What am I going to do now?" I only had a couple $100 to my name, and I got a big old 1969 Dodge Polara, big huge tank. Doesn't it sucks the fuel, not great in fuel mileage. I can't go that far with it. Didn't know what I was going to do. And I remembered the guy that I met in the monastery, and it turns out he lived in Texas. I'm like, let's go visit him. So I call him up, set his number, bust out the old Rolodex, because this is before cell phones and all that. So I bust out the Rolodex, I call him up, turns out he was in town. I go and visit with him. And so he recommended that I go to St. Mary's. So I spent the whole weekend with him. He was showing me all the propaganda films SSPX has and all that. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm all in, I'm doing it. So I got to St. Mary's. I had $20 to my name, and no place to live, no job, no nothing. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had faith. I had trust in God. And so I went to the church the next day, and I told the gal there, the secretary, whatever situation. And she's like, okay, let me put you in touch with somebody. And within a day, I had everything squared away. I had a place to live. I had a job. I had enough money for food for the month. And, so it all worked out. I was supposed to be there at that time. And so I can go on for hours about it. I got tons of stories. I won't for the sake of your audience. But it's just all these things connect. I don't look at that. I guess my point is I've talked to a number of people now who they're hung up on, if, all this time, and we just moved here, we just did this, and, now we're stuck. No, you're not stuck. This is part of the process. This is part of the growth process. The key is identifying, what you can do better now and doing that thing. That's what matters. The fact that you spent some time or effort, it was all value. It was all part of the process. And so for me, it was kind of the same deal there. It was good. I was there. There's a number of adventures, but after that, but ultimately, all of that kind of tie into the original story. As far as the tradition piece of it is, the more I learned the SSPX position, the more I understood that it honestly didn't represent the truly Catholic position, and that's, once again, it's that golden sifter. It was like, hey, we don't, yes, the things you're identifying as problematic are correct. They got that part right, but they weren't, the solution they proposed to it really wasn't something that I think made sense. And that's what led me, ultimately then to sedevacantism.
So why did you leave the Novus Ordo?
So Catholicism has a principle: as we worship, so we believe, and so we live. And, I think Orthodoxy would agree with that completely as well. But I just saw there being too much disparity between those things. This kind of comes back to the problem once again with the Byzantine. Sure, you're maybe utilizing a proper prayer life, a proper worship, but how does that correlate with beliefs when you still have theology? You're still relying on theology from the modern Catholic Church. You're still fall under that. And as you live, that's another piece of this, right? Christianity, I think I've always understood it should be transformative, and as we spoke about last time, Orthodoxy absolutely is transformative, and it's in everything that we do. And I don't see that nearly as much with the Western religions in their focus and emphasis on scholasticism and, the intellectual understanding of God, this knowledge that, or faith, rational faith, faith that boils down to rational understanding. As I mentioned before, and I'll probably talk about a little bit more here, faith faith for us is much more than that. It's an actual experience of God. These were some of the issues. I couldn't, the more I studied, the more I learned what the church actually had taught, the less I could reconcile it with what I was experiencing. And I'd like to actually go into the, rather just, make the statement, make the claim. I can actually go through, and I've prepared a few resources, from Catholic teaching. Everything I'm going to present today is official, formal Catholic teaching that you, as a Catholic, are supposed to abide by, supposed to accept, acknowledge, give it your intellectual assent to, and to follow. And so maybe at this point I'll just let the sources speak for themselves. Pope Boniface VIII in his bull Unum Sanctum from 1302, which is considered to be infallible, taught, We are compelled in virtue of our faith to believe and maintain that there is only one Catholic Church, and that one apostolic. This we firmly believe and profess without qualification. Outside this church there is no salvation and no remission of sins. Now this chosen one represents the one mystical body whose head is Christ, and Christ's head is God. In her there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. For at the time of the deluge there existed only one ark, in the figure of the one true church. Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Satis Cognitum from 1896, reiterated this doctrine. There is clear and abundant proof in sacred scripture that there is one genuine church of Jesus Christ. According to factual history, then Jesus Christ did not plan and establish a church made up of a number of organizations that were genetically similar, yet separate and without those bonds of unity which make the church one and indivisible, as we profess in the Creed, I believe in one church. When Jesus Christ spoke of this mystical structure, he spoke of one church only, which he called his own. I will build my church. So for all those Catholics who think, back in the day, they used to call them cafeteria Catholics, right, that think they can pick and choose what they want to believe in or accept or not, your own church doesn't agree with you. Your own church doesn't acknowledge that, doesn't accept that. So most people, unfortunately, they don't know that, but there's the teaching right there on that particular point. And there's more. Pope Benedict XV has some words on this in his encyclical Ad Beatissimi from 1914, where he states, "Such is the nature of Catholicism that it does not admit of more or less, but must be held as a whole, or as a whole rejected. This is the Catholic faith, which unless a man believe faithfully and firmly, he cannot be saved." And this is from the Athanasian Creed. So important is the necessity of the profession of true faith in its entirety that Pope Leo XIII warned again in Satis Cognitum. There can be nothing more dangerous than those heretics who admit nearly the whole series of doctrines, and yet, by one word, as with a drop of poison, taint the real and simple faith taught by our Lord and handed down by apostolic tradition. Finally, Pope Pius IX, in his Syllabus of Errors from 1864, condemned the following propositions. Remember, these are condemned propositions. Every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall have come to consider as true. Men can find the way of eternal salvation and reach eternal salvation in any form of religious worship. Once again, those are condemned propositions. So you can see the church, up until very recently, was very clear on these points. It did not allow for what I think probably the majority of people today think and believe on these things, right? I mean, the Catholic Church was always very clear. I mean, we have statements from the 1300s all the way, into the early 20th century. So that was consistent teaching, at least from the time of the schism, on this, and Council of Trent. And I mean, there's many others. I've only quoted a couple. There's many of these. There are many of these kinds of statements, but it's important to recognize that just because there's a certain sentiment that is taken hold of sort of the cultural zeitgeist doesn't mean that this is real, that this is acceptable. How is it? And here's the other part of that. If it's true that the church does really allow for this change, well, then it kind of negates the Catholic Church as being the true church, because the church has just said you couldn't have this. So let's go and read some of the statements from Vatican II and see how that matches up with what we just read. In the Degree on Ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, from November 21st, 1964, the Second Vatican Council promulgated the following. The brethren divided from us also carry out many of the sacred actions of the Christian religion, undoubtedly in ways that vary according to the condition of each church or community. These actions can truly engender a life of grace and can be rightly described as capable of providing access to the community of salvation. It follows that these separated churches and communities, though we believe that they suffer from defects already mentioned, have by no means been deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation. For the Spirit of Christ has not refrained from using them as means of salvation, which derive their efficacy from the very fullness of grace and truth entrusted to the Catholic Church. And the reality of it is that we have seen many, many instances of this carried out, not just in encyclicals that sort of like open that that up, but in real life, I mean, there's a whole website called Tradition in Action. If you Google the Revolution in Pictures, they catalog weekly, like all of the liturgical abuses that have been taking place for decades. I mean, that site existed back when I was still Catholic, and it's still out there. I actually verified that, still doing its thing. And so it's really astounding how much evidence there is of the church adopting a truly ecumenical mindset. I mean, all of the pictures, all the prayers, and going back to John Paul II getting signed with the sign of Shiva, and all the other things that have been out there for a long time, and I'm sure many others. How does that jive? How does that gel with, once again, what was taught before? So it's clear that you can't have it both ways, right? Like this was the hard conclusion that led me ultimately to be a Sedevacanist, was you can't have a church that says that these things ecumenism is not acceptable, salvation's only to be found in the Catholic Church, and then 100 years later say, well, actually, these churches are means of salvation, and essentially you don't have to be Catholic. And there's a lot more to that. The Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, and all this other weird language that was put in there to actually logically allow for other religions to be in there. I don't want to delve in the weeds and all this, but there's a lot of other supporting documentation or evidence to this. But the whole idea that we can take and ignore that past teaching, right? As a modern Catholic, when I was one, I just couldn't do it. There's just no way I could reconcile those. Now, the next argument that gets made by people that are on that, at least they used to make it, is, but those are not infallible teachings. Vatican II is not infallible. It's a pastoral council. It's not an ecumenical council, even though it's called, basically that, right? Vatican Council, Ecumenical Council. But that doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter because when you continue on in Pastor Aeternus from Vatican I, it's very clear about what constitutes infallible teaching. So let's look at that now. Wherefore, by divine and Catholic faith, all those things are to be believed which are contained in the Word of God, as found in Scripture and tradition, and which are proposed by the Church as matters to be believed as divinely revealed, whether by her solemn judgment or in her ordinary and universal magisterium. Wherefore we teach and declare that, by divine ordinance, the Roman Church possesses a preeminence of ordinary power over every other church, and that this jurisdictional power of the Roman Pontiff is both episcopal and immediate. Both clergy and faithful, of whatever right and dignity, both singularly and collectively, are bound to submit to this power by the duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience. And this not only in matters concerning faith and morals, but also in those which regard the discipline and government of the Church throughout the world. So once again, it's clear that all of the things that have been going on in the Church should fall under that blanket of infallibility, right? So if somebody wants to fall back on the argument or sort of the defense that, these things aren't infallible, we don't really need to follow them because they're not from a solemn pronouncement, right? It doesn't matter because the Vatican I, that's a myth. Vatican I doesn't limit it only to that, infallibility only to that. It establishes it as the normal operating of the Church, basically. So all of these encyclicals collectively, the governance of the Church, all these are things that have to be believed and followed. And once again, as somebody who is in that, who doesn't want to acknowledge that, who essentially tries to escape to the Byzantine Rite because they don't want to be bound to that or held to that, you still are. Like there's no escaping that. And so once again, I don't say this with any kind of pleasure. Honestly, it breaks my heart because I know how many really good people exist, in these various faiths, and how they really are trying to do the best they can, and once again, well-intentioned, really making a lot of sacrifices, to take their family to church and to do all these things. So it's with no joy that I discuss this, but I guess I've been given a unique perspective that I don't really hear out there much in the online space, and that's why I present this, because I just think there's just a lot of people just don't know. They don't know. Now, obviously, just knowing isn't sufficient. I mean, somebody has to act on that knowledge, but if you never knew these things, like how can how can you sort it out? How can you figure it out? I don't, in my case, my own case, I don't take any credit. I mean, it's just a pure grace, thank God that I was able to, make it, see these things, that I was presented these things, I discovered these things. And so we never want to be complacent about the gifts that we've been given, the blessings we've been given. It's not, I did not merit those graces, or any of my actions warrant them. This was pure blessing of God. And I just, it puts a certain duty on me to share what I've received. And that's all. And I hope and pray that people receive it in the spirit that it's offered. This is not to try to crush anyone or to try to, once again, be triumphalistic about it. It's none of that. This is a process that I had to work through, like say a long time ago. But it's ultimately part of my story. It's part of how I got to where I am now, and why now I can share this and present this information with others. Because I think there's just probably a lot of people that don't know about this.